The moment Lavinia Keene stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the sweltering summer of 1882, she had exactly $4.32 in her coat pocket, a single carpetbag of belongings, and the fierce, unshakable belief that she could build a life out of nothing if only the West would give her half a chance. She had come from Cincinnati, Ohio, where the thread mill she had worked since she was 16 years old had burned to the ground in February, taking with it the livelihoods of 200 women and the only steady wage Lavinia had ever known. She was 24 years old, clear-eyed, and entirely without sentimentality about her situation. Her mother had passed 3 years prior, her father long before that, and she had no brothers or sisters to lean on. There was no one waiting for her to come back east, and so she had done the only sensible thing she could think of. She had used her last wages to purchase a stage ticket as far west as her money would carry her, read every newspaper advertisement she could find along the way, and arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, with a small handwritten list of establishments rumored to be hiring. Caldwell in 1882 was a cattle town straining at its seams. It sat right on the Kansas Indian Territory border, the last major stop on the Kishom Trail before drovers pushed into Texas, and it was the kind of place where fortune and disaster often arrived on the same horse. The main street was wide and deeply rutted from cattle drives, lined with saloons, dry goods stores, a hotel of questionable comfort, a livery stable, and a land office. Dust rose constantly from the road and settled on everything. The smell of cattle and horses was inescapable. Lavinia adjusted the collar of her blue traveling dress, picked up her carpetbag, and walked straight toward the largest building on the main street, which happened to be the Caldwell Grand Hotel, though it was neither particularly grand nor particularly comfortable. The woman behind the front desk was a stout, sharp-tongued widow named Mrs. Harriet Cobble, who ran the hotel with an iron fist and a nose for nonsense. "I am looking for work," Lavinia said, standing at the desk with her spine perfectly straight, the way her mother had always told her to stand when she needed to be taken seriously. "I am experienced in laundering, cooking, mending, bookkeeping, and managing inventory. I am not afraid of hard work, and I am not looking for charity." Mrs. Cobble looked her up and down the way a buyer examines livestock. "Where are you from?" "Cincinnati." "You got family here?" "No." "Then why on earth did you come out here?" "Because the mill I worked at burned down and I heard there was work in the West for women willing to do it." Mrs. Cobble's expression softened by approximately 1 degree. "I could use someone in the laundry. Sundays off. Board included, shared room with my niece, 50 cents a day." Lavinia had hoped for more, but she was not foolish enough to say so on her first day in a new town. "I accept," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Cobble." That first week, Lavinia worked from before sunup to well after dark. The hotel laundry was brutal work, her hands raw from the lye soap and the hot water by the end of each day, her back aching from the heavy wet linens. But she did not complain. She ate whatever was put in front of her at the kitchen table, shared the small upstairs room with Mrs. Cobble's niece, a cheerful girl named Dottie who talked endlessly about a young man who worked at the land office, and she saved every cent she earned. She also kept her eyes open, because Lavinia Keene had not come all the way to Kansas to wash other people's sheets forever. She was watching, listening, learning what this town needed and where a woman with her particular set of skills might find something more lasting. It was on a Thursday morning, 9 days after her arrival, that she first saw Frank Thatcher. She was hanging sheets on the line behind the hotel when she heard a commotion in the alley, not violent, not dangerous, just noisy. 2 cowhands were arguing loudly about the price of something or other, and between them stood a man who was clearly trying to mediate before things got out of hand. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck beneath his hat, and he had the kind of weathered, angular face that comes from years of working in full sun. He was not the most classically handsome man Lavinia had ever seen, but there was something about the way he carried himself steady, unhurried, completely unintimidated by either of the two louder men, that made her pause with a wet sheet in her hands, and simply look for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He settled the argument quickly, and with such calm authority that both cowhands ended up laughing and slapping each other on the back within 2 minutes. Then he turned and walked toward the street, and for just a moment he glanced back toward the hotel yard and noticed Lavinia standing there with her armful of wet linen. He touched the brim of his hat. She nodded back, the way you would to any passing stranger. He walked on. She went back to her sheets. She did not think about him again until that evening when Dottie came home from an errand practically vibrating with local gossip, which was her natural state. "Did you see Frank Thatcher in town today?" Dottie asked, dropping onto the edge of her bed. "He comes in maybe once a month for supplies. He runs the Thatcher spread north of here, about 12 miles out. It is one of the finest cattle ranches in this whole part of Kansas, people say. He has been running it alone since his father died 2 years ago. He is 30 years old and not married, which half the women in Caldwell consider a personal affront." "Is that so?" Lavinia said, not looking up from the mending she was doing by lamplight. "He is not unfriendly, just quiet," Dottie continued, clearly warming to her subject. "He minds his own business, which is more than you can say for most men around here. He bought the Henderson parcel last spring, so now his spread goes all the way to Bluff Creek. Over 2,000 acres, they say." Lavinia set down her mending. "Dottie, do you know if he is hiring?" Dottie blinked. "I have absolutely no idea." "Why?" Lavinia picked her mending back up. "Because I am a hard worker looking for better prospects, and a ranch that size requires a great deal of managing." Dottie stared at her with an expression that suggested she found this response wildly insufficient. "He is also very handsome," she offered helpfully. "I did not notice," Lavinia said, which was not entirely true, but was near enough to it that she felt comfortable saying it. She did not rush toward anything. That was not her nature. She spent another 2 weeks at the hotel, learning the rhythms of the town, making careful note of who was respectable and who was not, who kept their word and who did not, and quietly asking around whenever she had a spare moment. What she heard about Frank Thatcher was consistent regardless of who she asked. He was honest. He was fair with his hands. He paid his bills on time. He was not a drinking man, not a gambling man, and not a man who picked fights. His ranch was producing well despite a difficult year of weather, because he worked it with a methodical intelligence that older ranchers in the area privately envied. What she also heard from Mr. Dawes at the dry goods store was that Frank Thatcher's housekeeper of 7 years had recently moved to Wichita to be with her daughter, and that the ranch house had been in a state of managed chaos since then. On the morning of her third Saturday in Caldwell, Lavinia put on her second-best dress, borrowed Dottie's good hat pin, and arranged for a ride north from a freighter named Old Pete who made regular supply runs, and who agreed to take her as far as the Thatcher gate for 15 cents. The Thatcher spread was exactly as described. The gate was a solid construction of cedar posts, and beyond it the land rolled away in long green waves toward the creek, dotted with the dark shapes of cattle. The ranch house itself was large by frontier standards, a solid 2-story structure built from local limestone, with a covered porch running the full length of the front, a separate cookhouse to the side, a large barn, 2 smaller outbuildings, and a bunkhouse for the hands. It was not elegant, but it was well built and well maintained, and someone had planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house that had clearly been neglected over the past several weeks. She walked up the front path and knocked on the door. There was a long pause, and then the door opened and Frank Thatcher was standing there in his work clothes, his hat in his hand because he had apparently just taken it off, looking at her with an expression of complete and total puzzlement. "Good morning," Lavinia said. "My name is Lavinia Keene. I have recently come from Cincinnati and I am currently employed at the Caldwell Grand Hotel, but I understand you are in need of someone to manage your household, and I believe I am qualified to do the job. I am experienced in cooking, preserving, laundering, mending, and household accounts. I can manage a kitchen garden, and I have some knowledge of cattle operations from my father, who kept stock. I'm asking for room and board and $1 per day, which I believe is a fair wage for the scope of work involved." Frank Thatcher looked at her for a long, measuring moment. Up close, his eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that reminded her of the Ohio River in late autumn. He did not seem startled so much as carefully thoughtful. "Did someone send you?" he asked. His voice was lower than she had expected, steady and unhurried. "No," she said. "I came on my own account. You walked out here." "I rode with old Pete's freight wagon to your gate and walked from there." He leaned against the doorframe and glanced past her at the long, empty road. "That is a considerable effort for a job you don't know you have." "I prefer not to write letters when I can speak for myself," she said. "It is harder to misrepresent your capabilities in person." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. He stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "I was just about to make coffee, though I will warn you it is not good coffee. That is one of the more immediate problems." She followed him inside. The kitchen was not dirty so much as overwhelmingly disorganized. Pots were stacked in no particular order. The flour bin was nearly empty. A dozen things that should have been on shelves were on the table, and the stove needed a thorough cleaning. The coffee he made was, as promised, quite bad. She drank it without comment. They sat at the kitchen table, and he asked her careful, practical questions. Where had she worked before the mill? What she knew about preserving and smoking meat. Whether she could manage accounts, and whether she was comfortable handling the household budget independently. Whether she was prepared for the relative isolation of ranch life, 12 miles from town. Whether she had any family who might call her back east. She answered everything directly and honestly, including the last one. "No," she said, "I have no family remaining. I came west because I intend to build something here. I'm not looking for temporary employment." He looked at her across the table with that steady, thoughtful gaze that she was already beginning to recognize as characteristic. "All right," he said. "The room is upstairs, second door on the left. It is private and has its own window. $1 a day, room and board. I require honesty above all other things. If something is wrong, you say so. If I am wrong about something, you say so. I do not like discovering problems that have been hidden from me." "We are in complete agreement," she said. That was how it began. She gave her notice to Mrs. Cowboy the following Monday, survived the pointed look that the woman gave her and the carefully worded advice about the unwisdom of a young woman living alone on a ranch with a bachelor, and moved out to the Thatcher spread on Wednesday of that same week. She arrived with her carpetbag, and a second bag she had packed with some supplies she had purchased from Dawes' store, because she had already made a list of what the kitchen needed, and she saw no reason to wait. Her room upstairs was simple and clean, with a good-sized window that looked south toward the kitchen garden and the rolling country beyond. There was a bed with a decent mattress, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a hook on the door. She unpacked her things carefully and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the Kansas land stretching away under a tremendous sky full of summer cloud, and felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Something more fundamental than that. Something that felt like the right beginning. She went downstairs and started on the kitchen. Frank Thatcher had 3 full-time hands. A lanky young man named Billy Crane, who was 19 and enthusiastic about everything. An older Mexican vaquero named Ernesto Reyes, who had worked cattle his whole life, and who regarded the world with magnificent, dignified calm. And a quiet man named Thomas Ward, who spoke very little but could fix absolutely anything that had a moving part. They ate supper in the bunkhouse, but they came to the cookhouse for their noon meal, and within the first week it became clear to all 3 of them that something significant had changed in the domestic operation of the Thatcher ranch. Lavinia cooked the way she did everything else, methodically and well. She had the kitchen organized within 2 days. the garden weeded and producing again within a week, the household accounts reorganized within 10 days. She found a notation error in the ledger that had been causing Frank a quiet irritation for 3 months, and corrected it with a brief note left on the kitchen table along with his morning coffee, which was now considerably better than it had been. He came in for that coffee early one morning, read the note, studied the corrected figures, and looked up at her with an expression that was part gratitude and part rueful amusement. "I spent 2 evenings on those figures," he said. "The error was in the June column," she said, setting a plate of biscuits on the table. "It was a simple transposition. Anyone would have done the same." "I appreciate it," he said, and there was something in the plainness of how he said it that felt more genuine than elaborate thanks would have. That was what she noticed first about Frank Thatcher, not his looks, though she was aware of those, and not the steadiness of him, though she appreciated that. What she noticed first was that he meant what he said. Every word exactly as spoken. There was no performance in him, no gap between what he said and what he meant, and in her experience that was a rarer quality than most people understood. August arrived with its full force, baking the Kansas prairie into a brittle gold. The cattle drives through Caldwell were at their peak, which meant noise and dust and business for everyone in the county, and Frank spent long days riding fence lines and checking the water sources for his stock. He came in for supper most evenings dusty and tired, ate well, and more often than not, instead of retiring immediately, he would sit on the porch in the cooling dark with a cup of coffee and look out at his land. Lavinia had a habit of bringing her mending to the porch after supper. It was cooler there, and the evenings were genuinely beautiful. The enormous sky over the Kansas plains going through colors at sunset that she had never seen in Ohio, deep gold and rose, and a blue so saturated it looked like something out of a painting. She had not intended the porch time to become a shared thing, but it simply did, the way natural rhythms establish themselves without deliberate arrangement. They talked slowly at first, in the manner of 2 private people who were not accustomed to easy conversation, but found they enjoyed it when it came. He told her about the ranch, about the particular challenges of the Kansas summers and the winters that followed them, about his father who had built the main house stone by stone and who had taught him everything he knew about cattle. She told him about Cincinnati, about the mill, about her mother who had been a practical woman with a gift for making very little feel like enough. She did not tell him about the fear that had accompanied her on the stage west, the particular dread of arriving somewhere new with nearly nothing, the way she had lain awake in Dottie's small room those first nights and had a quiet private conversation with herself about courage. But one evening in late August, when the sky was purple and the first stars were coming out, he said, "It takes something particular to do what you did. Come west alone, walk up to a stranger's door." She looked up from her mending. "What sort of something?" "Courage," he said simply, "or desperation, or both, I suppose, which might be the same thing." "I was not desperate," she said carefully. "I was without options, which is different. Desperate people do not make good decisions. I was simply being practical." He considered this. "You are a very practical person." "I have had to be." "That is not a criticism," he said. "I mean it as a genuine observation. You are practical in the way that some people are musical. It seems to come naturally." She set her mending in her lap and looked at him directly, because she had learned already that he received directness well. "And you are steady," she said. "In the same way. It is not something you perform. It is simply what you are." He looked at her for a moment without speaking. The evening had gone very quiet around them, only the sound of the horses in the distant pasture and the first crickets starting up. "I appreciate that you see it that way," he said at last, quietly. It was not a declaration of anything. It was simply an honest exchange between 2 people who had been paying careful attention to each other, and that was precisely what made it significant. September came in with a sudden cold snap that reminded everyone that Kansas winters were not forgiving. Lavinia began putting up preserves in earnest, filling the cellar with everything the garden had produced over the summer, and everything she had acquired at the Caldwell market. Frank began moving cattle to the winter pastures, a process that took the better part of 2 weeks and required all hands working from first light. It was during this period that Lavinia first saw Frank Thatcher in the full force of what he was. She had known he was competent, of course, but watching him work cattle was something else entirely. He moved on horseback with a kind of instinctive intelligence, reading the animals the way she read a ledger, and his hands respected him in the easy, undemonstrative way that men respect someone who genuinely knows more than they do and does not need to announce it. She brought noon meals out to the crew during those weeks. It was the practical thing to do, saving time, and one afternoon Billy Crane, who had adopted her as a sort of honorary older sister in the way that very young men do, sat down beside her on the back of the supply wagon and jerked his chin toward Frank, who was 50 yards away sorting a small herd of strays back into the main group with what looked like minimal effort. "He has been different this fall," Billy said, in the confidential tone of someone who has been waiting for an opportunity to share an important observation. "Different how?" Lavinia asked, watching Frank cut a steer back toward the group with a subtle shift of his horse's weight. Billy considered. "More like he used to be," he said at last. "Before his pa died and then before Mrs. Henderson quit, he was carrying something heavy for a while there. He is not carrying it so much now." Lavinia looked down at the cloth she was folding over the remaining biscuits. "I am glad to hear it," she said. "He is a good man," Billy added, with the earnest simplicity of 19. "The best I have ever worked for, and I have worked for 3 others." "I believe that," Lavinia said honestly. What she did not say, because it was too early to say it and she was too careful to say it before she was certain, was that she had begun to realize that her feelings for Frank Thatcher had moved some distance past professional respect. She had been watching for this possibility the way you watch for weather on the horizon, because she was not naive about the nature of living in close proximity to a man she already admired, and she did not want to mistake something ordinary for something exceptional. But as September turned and the air sharpened and the evenings on the porch grew shorter and colder, she had to acknowledge to herself, with the same clear honesty she applied to everything else, that what she felt for him was not ordinary. He was thoughtful. He listened when she spoke with a quality of attention that made her feel, in a way she had not felt in a long time, that what she said genuinely mattered. He was not effusive or demonstrative, but she had not expected that and did not need it. What she had found, and what she had not expected to find so quickly or so thoroughly, was a man whose company she genuinely wanted. The question of what, if anything, he felt was one she had not yet attempted to answer. October arrived, and with it a piece of news from Caldwell that changed the temperature of several conversations in town. A man named Carter Holloway had come in from Dodge City looking to buy up land along Bluff Creek, and he had made it known through several intermediaries that he was interested in the Henderson parcel, the same parcel Frank had purchased the previous spring, and which now formed the eastern boundary of the Thatcher spread. The complication was that there had apparently been a dispute about the original survey of that parcel, and Holloway's interest had emboldened the previous Henderson heirs to raise questions they had let lie for months. Frank came home from a trip to Caldwell on the second Friday of October with the news, and Lavinia could see from the set of his jaw when he came through the door that it was not good. She poured him coffee and set it on the table and waited, because she had learned that he sorted his thoughts best without prompting. "Holloway wants to bring in a competing survey," Frank said at last. "He has money and he has connections. If he can get the Henderson heirs to contest the original sale, he could tie up the eastern pasture in court for years." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "That pasture is where I winter 200 head. Without it, I'm either buying feed at a price I cannot sustain or I am selling off a third of my cattle." Lavinia sat down across from him. "What are the terms of the original purchase?" he told her. She asked him several more precise questions, and he answered them all. She knew enough from her years of careful household accounting, and from her father's modest cattle keeping to understand what was at stake, and she also knew enough about legal disputes from the mill's own endless administrative complications to have an opinion about it. You need to get your documentation to the county recorder's office ahead of any competing claim, she said. If the original survey is on file and properly recorded, it is much harder to contest, is it? I believed it was, Frank said. I need to confirm. Then go to Wichita, she said. Not Caldwell. The county seat has the full records, and go soon. Holloway is already here. He looked at her across the table. You are right, he said. I will go Monday. I will have your papers organized before you leave, she said. Everything you have related to that purchase, dates, correspondence, the original deed. I will go through the files tomorrow. He was quiet for a moment. Lavinia, he said, and something in the way he said her name, not Mrs. Keene, as he had called her for the first 2 months, but Lavinia, as he had begun to call her somewhere in September, made her look up from her coffee. I want you to know that what you have brought to this place, I do not take it for granted. She held his gaze for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing leaves against the porch in a dry, rattling rush. I know you do not, she said softly. He rode to Wichita on Monday with a clean, well-organized folder of every relevant document she had spent Sunday going through, cross-referencing, and annotating in her neat, precise hand. He returned Wednesday evening with the confirmation that the survey was fully recorded and with the advice of an attorney he had seen there. Holloway's gambit, the attorney had said, was essentially a bluff. Without a legitimate competing deed, he had no case. The threat dissolved as quickly as it had materialized. Holloway moved on from Caldwell by the end of October, apparently finding his money better spent elsewhere. But something else had not dissolved. Frank came home that Wednesday evening with something different in his expression, not the relief of the resolved legal matter, though that was there too. There was something else beneath it, something she recognized because she had been feeling it herself for weeks, a kind of deliberate restraint that was beginning to cost him something. He sat on the porch that evening even though the cold had made evenings out there genuinely uncomfortable, and she brought blankets from inside and sat in her usual chair and wrapped one around her shoulders, and he looked at her with the particular directness that she associated with his most honest moments. I have been thinking, he said, about what this place was like before you came. You managed, she said. I did not, he said. Not well. I was managing the cattle fine, but the rest of it was falling to pieces without my noticing, which is worse. The house, the accounts, the garden. I told myself I was all right because I did not know what all right actually looked like anymore. She was very still. I do not want to say something that changes what we have here, he said carefully. You are the best thing that has happened to this ranch in 2 years, and I would rather keep what we have than lose it trying for something more. Then tell me what you are trying to say, she said quietly, and we will decide together. He turned toward her fully. His eyes were very steady, that gray-green she had memorized without meaning to. I think about you, he said simply. Considerably more than is probably professional. I think about what you said about your mother, and about Cincinnati, and about the particular way you laughed that time Billy fell off the fence last month. I think about you being here when I come home, and about what it would mean if you were not. The wind moved through the dry grass of the home pasture with a long, whispering sound. The stars over Kansas were brilliant and thick above them, the way they only were out on the open plain away from town lights. Frank, she said, and her own voice was steadier than she had expected it to be. I came here looking for work. That is the truth, but what I found here is something I did not know I was looking for. She paused, gathering the words carefully. I have been careful because I did not want to mistake gratitude for something deeper, but it is not gratitude. I know the difference. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, the way he did most things without drama, completely directly. His hand was warm and calloused and absolutely certain. May I court you, he asked. Properly. I want to do this right. Lavinia looked at their joined hands and felt something in her chest break open in the best possible way, the way a window opens onto clean air. You may, she said. The courting, as Frank Thatcher conducted it, was entirely consistent with his character. He was not a man for grand gestures or florid speeches. What he did instead was pay attention. He brought her a single late-blooming wildflower he had found while riding fence on a Tuesday morning and set it in her kitchen window without explanation. He asked her one evening what she had liked best about Cincinnati, and then listened to her talk about the river and the autumn leaves for an hour with complete genuine interest. He came in from a supply run to Caldwell one afternoon with a book of American poetry that he had noticed her looking at in Dawes' store 2 weeks earlier and had apparently made a note of. "I thought you might like it," he said, setting it beside her coffee. She held it for a moment, this small, particular proof that he had been watching her the way she had been watching him. "I do like it," she said. He smiled, and she had by now catalogued his smiles the way a scientist catalogues specimens, from the brief professional kind to the one he used with Billy when the boy said something endearing to this one, which was quieter and warmer, and which she was beginning to suspect was reserved primarily for her. November came in gray and cold. The first hard frost killed the remaining garden, and Lavinia closed up the kitchen garden for the winter with the satisfaction of knowing the cellar was full and the household was ready. She had never truly had a home to prepare for winter before, not since her mother's small house in Cincinnati, and the act of it, the putting up and the preserving and the stacking of wood and the winterizing of the windows, gave her a feeling she was only just beginning to let herself name. She wrote a letter to Dottie in Caldwell because they had kept up a correspondence, and she told her that things were going very well. She did not, in that letter, go into particulars about Frank, but Dottie was a naturally perceptive person when she put her mind to it, and the reply she received 2 weeks later contained the words, "I knew it," underlined 3 times, which made Lavinia laugh alone in the kitchen in a way that surprised her with its lightness. On the first Saturday of November, Frank asked if she would like to ride with him to check the eastern fence line. He offered it casually, as if it might merely be practical. She could identify any gaps in the windbreak plantings along that section, he said. She accepted in the same spirit, though they both knew it for what it was. They rode out in the clear cold morning, side by side on the flat Kansas land, the sky overhead a pale brilliant blue, the grass a deep gold going to brown, and the Bluff Creek cottonwoods throwing their last yellow leaves in the wind. Frank rode his big bay gelding and lent her the mare, a gentle, steady animal named Clara who moved like thought. They talked about very little and everything. He pointed out a hawk making its precise circles above the creek bend. She noticed where a section of windbreak needed replacement and said so, and he agreed and made a note in the small book he kept in his coat pocket. They rode along the creek for a while in easy silence, the water low and clear over the flat limestone bottom. They stopped at a bend in the creek where a cottonwood the size of a cathedral stood on the bank, its remaining leaves shaking in the light wind with a sound like distant applause. The horses dropped their heads to drink from the shallows. "This was the first piece of land my father showed me," Frank said. He was looking at the tree. "I was about 7. He brought me out here on his horse and said, 'This is ours, son, ours to care for and to keep.' I did not fully understand it then. I understand it now." Lavinia looked at his profile against the pale autumn sky. "He would be proud of what you have built here," she said. He turned to look at her. The sun was low and came across the water and lit his face from the side, and he looked in that moment like something she wanted to keep. "I want this to be yours too," he said. "The land, the house, all of it. I want you to know that what I am asking when I get around to asking it properly is not a small thing. I know you came here to build something of your own. I am not asking you to give that up. I am asking if we might build it together." Lavinia sat very still on the gentle mare, while the cottonwood leaves fell slowly around them in the November light. She had come west with $4.32 and a list of places that might be hiring. She had come looking for work. She had not come looking for this, but here it was. "You should ask it properly then," she said. His expression was open and serious and entirely unguarded, more so than she had ever seen him. "Lavinia Keene," he said, "will you marry me?" The creek moved over its stones. The hawk made another circle above the bend. A cold, bright wind came up the valley from the south and moved through the tall grass in a long silver wave. "Yes," she said, "Frank Thatcher, I will." He crossed the small space between their horses and took her face in both his hands and kissed her, and it was as steady and certain and genuine as everything else about him. And she kissed him back with every bit of the careful feeling she had been holding for months, and the cottonwood leaves came down around them like something out of a story. The ride back to the house was different from the ride out. She was not sure if the land had changed or if she had, but the ranch looked different to her as they came back up the long slope from the creek, more solid, more real, more hers in some way that she had not allowed herself to feel before. Frank rode beside her close enough that their stirrups nearly touched, and he was smiling in the quiet, warm way that she had decided was the best of his smiles, and she felt, for the first time in several years, completely unafraid of what came next. They told the hands that evening. Ernesto Reyes took the news with the dignified warmth that characterized everything he did, shaking Frank's hand, and then bowing slightly to Lavinia in a formal, gracious gesture that moved her unexpectedly. Billy Crane's reaction was essentially to shout with joy, which startled the horses in the nearest corral. Thomas Ward said, "Good," and nodded twice, and in Thomas Ward this constituted an outpouring of sentiment. Lavinia wrote to Dottie that night. The reply came back within 4 days, which was as fast as the post ever moved, containing the information that Dottie had known this would happen from approximately the second week of Lavinia's employment, and that she was coming out to the ranch at the first opportunity to hear everything and to approve of Frank Thatcher at close range. She did come on the following Saturday with her young man from the land office in tow, and the 4 of them had supper at the big kitchen table, and the conversation was loud and warm and wonderfully ordinary. And when Dottie left that evening, she squeezed Lavinia's hand at the door and said, very quietly, "He looks at you like you are the only fixed point in the world. You know that, do you not?" "I know it," Lavinia said. They were married in the second week of December, 1882, at the small church in Caldwell that had been established just the year before. It was a simple ceremony. Lavinia wore her best dress, which was a deep green wool that Mrs. Cowboy had actually been quite kind about, pressing it herself, and presenting it to Lavinia that morning with a gruffness that was clearly covering genuine emotion. Frank wore his good dark coat, and a white shirt that Billy Crane had pressed with considerable effort and visible pride. The minister was a pleasant young man named Reverend Alderton, who had come west from Illinois the previous spring, and who was still slightly astonished by nearly everything in Kansas. He performed the ceremony with real feeling, and the small church was full enough. Ernesto and Billy and Thomas, Dottie and her young man, Mr. and Mrs. Dawes from the dry goods store, old Pete who had driven Lavinia out to the ranch on that first morning, and who was apparently sentimental about the whole thing, and a number of Frank's neighboring ranchers who had ridden in for the occasion. When Reverend Alderton said, "You may kiss your bride," Frank took her hands and kissed her with a gravity and a tenderness that made several of the women in the back pew produce handkerchiefs, and Lavinia, who was not a woman who cried easily, felt the back of her throat go thick with something that was entirely happy. After the wedding, they had a supper at the Caldwell Hotel, arranged by Mrs. Cowboy with an organizational competence that Lavinia sincerely admired. There was more food than anyone could reasonably eat, and someone produced a fiddle, and the evening became one of those genuinely beautiful things that happen in small communities in hard places, people choosing joy together against the backdrop of a difficult life, making warmth on purpose against the cold. Frank danced, which surprised her. He was not elegant, but he was precise and he had good timing, and when he took her hand for the first slow waltz and pulled her close, he said quietly against her temple, "I am not much of a dancer." "You are better than you think," she said. "You are kind." "I am practical," she said. "There is a difference. I would tell you if you were terrible." He laughed, and she felt it against her cheek, and the fiddle played on. They drove home to the ranch in the December cold under a sky so full of stars, it seemed almost to press down toward the earth, wrapped in blankets on the wagon seat with Lavinia's shoulder against Frank's arm, and the Kansas land silver and still around them in the moonlight. She had come to this country with nothing but herself. She was going home now with everything that mattered. The first winter of their marriage was as hard as a Kansas winter reliably was. They lost 4 head of cattle to a blizzard in January that came down fast and buried the eastern pasture under 3 feet of snow. Frank and Thomas rode out in the aftermath to find what could be found, and Lavinia spent those 2 days managing the house and the remaining animals with Billy, keeping the stove stoked and the water from freezing in the troughs and preparing warm food for when the men came back. When Frank came home on the second evening, frost on his eyebrows and exhaustion in every line of him, she had the stove at full heat and supper on the table and a dry set of clothes warming by the fire. He came through the door and stood for a moment just looking at the warm kitchen and at her, and then he crossed the room and pulled her into his arms and simply held on for a long moment without saying anything, still cold from the outside, and she wrapped her arms around his back and held him back just as tightly. "4," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "I am sorry. It could have been worse." "It could have," she agreed. "You kept everything else running," he said. "Billy and I did," she said fairly. "He is very capable when properly directed." He lifted his head and looked at her with the warm, quiet smile. "You are very good at properly directing," he said. They lost more cattle that winter than Frank had wanted to, and the spring of 1883 required hard decisions about the herd. Lavinia sat with him over the accounts in the evenings, working through the numbers with him, her practical mind finding angles and possibilities that he had not considered. The eastern pasture, which Holloway had tried to claim, proved its worth that spring when the grass came in early and thick along the creek bottom. They moved the remaining cattle there in March and watched them recover their condition over the next 2 months with the gratitude of people who understood how close the margins had been. In April, Lavinia realized she was expecting. She sat with this knowledge quietly for 4 days before she told Frank, because she wanted to be certain of it, and because she wanted to have thought through what she felt about it before she said anything. What she felt, she determined, was a complex mixture of joy and solemnity, and something that was almost the recognition that this was entirely new territory, something no amount of practical preparation fully addressed. She told him on a Wednesday evening, on the porch, because that was where they told each other the important things. She said it simply and directly as she said everything, and watched his face change in the lamplight that came through the window, the immediate stillness, and then something opening up beneath it like sunlight through a moving cloud. He said nothing for what felt like a full minute. Then he reached across and took both her hands in his. "Are you well?" he asked, and the care in his voice was so thorough and immediate that she had to take a moment before answering. "I am very well," she said. "I am sturdy, Frank." "You know that." "I know that," he said. "I also know that sturdy and invincible are not the same thing." "No," she agreed, "but I am not afraid, are you?" He thought about this honestly, the way he thought about everything. "I am afraid of not being enough," he said, "of the 1,000 ways a man can fail the people he loves most." "You are not failing anyone," she said firmly, "and you are not going to. I have been watching you for nearly a year. I know exactly what kind of man you are." He raised her hands and pressed his forehead against them in a gesture that was entirely unlike his usual contained manner, and which, for that reason, moved her more than anything more theatrical would have. "I love you," he said quietly against her hands. It was the first time he had said it precisely that way, and she felt it go through her like a long, clear note. "I love you," she said back. "Now let us go inside. It is cold and I am not allowing you to get sentimental on the porch in April." He laughed, and they went inside, and the lamp burned warm in the kitchen window for a long time that night. The pregnancy was unremarkable in the best possible sense. Lavinia was, as she had said, sturdy. She continued to manage the household with the same efficient precision, modifying her physical activities sensibly as the months progressed, but refusing to be treated as though she were made of glass. Frank hovered at a careful, respectful distance, managing his concern with a discipline that she appreciated enormously, though she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression of focused, protective attention that he had clearly learned to keep mostly off his face. She sent for a woman named Mrs. Calhoun from Caldwell in August, a practical and experienced midwife who had delivered half the babies in Sumner County and who took one look at Lavinia and declared her the most sensible, expectant mother she had dealt with in 2 years. Lavinia considered this a high compliment. In September of 1883, on a clear blue morning with the prairie wind running warm and sweet through the grass, Lavinia Thatcher gave birth to a son. He was healthy and loud, and entirely certain of his own importance from his first minute, which made both his parents laugh despite themselves in the exhausted, half-disbelieving way of new parents everywhere. Mrs. Calhoun declared him a fine boy. Billy Crane, waiting anxiously on the porch, was reportedly so relieved when he heard the baby cry that he sat down directly on the porch steps. Frank came into the bedroom where Lavinia lay propped against the pillows, the baby bundled in the crook of her arm, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at them both with an expression that she later thought was the most nakedly moved she had ever seen him. "Come here," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she laid the baby in his arms with the careful instruction of someone who was fairly certain her husband had not held an infant recently and did not want him to drop it, and he took the boy with a stunned and absolute gentleness, looking down at his face. "He looks like your father," Lavinia said. "He does a little," Frank agreed, his voice not quite as steady as usual. "We should name him Daniel," she said. "For your father." He looked up at her. "I would like that very much," he said. Daniel James Thatcher arrived in the world with opinions and a strong constitution and an early facility for charm that clearly came from some side of the family that Lavinia was not going to claim responsibility for. He grew through his first winter with steady confidence, and by the following spring he was sitting up and looking at the world with an expression of imperious curiosity that Lavinia privately found hilarious, though she maintained a dignified exterior about it. The ranch expanded that year. Frank bought 200 additional head of cattle from a neighbor selling off his stock to retire, and the spring roundup was the largest they had managed. Ernesto took on training a new hand, a young Mexican man named Rafael who was 18 and quick to learn, and the bunkhouse had a full complement for the first time since Frank had taken over from his father. The summer of 1884 brought a development that none of them had anticipated. A railroad spur was being extended through Sumner County, and the routing had been confirmed to run within 4 miles of the Thatcher spread. Frank and Lavinia spent several evenings working through what this might mean: easier access to market, reduced drive distances, better prices per head, the possibility of expanding the operation in ways that had not previously been practical. "We will need more pasture," Lavinia said one evening, spreading the county map on the kitchen table and pointing to a section north of their current holding. "The Dawson parcel. It has been sitting empty since old Mr. Dawson moved to his daughter's place in Topeka. It would give us direct access to the North Creek and nearly double our winter capacity." Frank leaned over the map beside her, his shoulder warm against hers. "You have been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since March," she admitted. "I wanted to see how the spring calves came in before I brought it up." "How did they come in?" "Very well, better than last year." She tapped the Dawson section. "We can afford it, not comfortably, but we can manage it if we are careful in the autumn." He was quiet for a moment, studying the map with his characteristic thoroughness. Then he straightened and looked at her. "Lavinia," he said, "I want to say something to you." She looked up at him. When I think about what this ranch was 3 years ago, he said, and what it is now, I am aware of how much of that is you. Not just the house and the accounts and the garden, though all of that matters tremendously, but the way you think about this land, about the future of it. You think about it the way my father did. You think about it as something worth building and protecting for what comes after us. Lavinia set down her pen. It is mine too, she said. You told me that on the bank of Bluff Creek before you even asked me to marry you, and I took you at your word. I meant every syllable of it, he said. I know you did, she said. That is why I have been planning since March. He smiled, and she returned it, and Daniel, who had woken from his nap and was investigating something under the kitchen table, said something emphatic and wordless that they both understood to be an opinion. They purchased the Dawson parcel in October of 1884, and the expansion proved, over the following year, to be exactly as wise as Lavinia had calculated it would be. The railroad spur came through in early 1885, and the difference in the cattle market was immediate and significant. Frank moved his first full rail shipment in March and came home that evening with a look on his face that she had seen before, on the porch in November of 1882 over coffee, that particular expression of a hard thing resolved, a long-held worry finally laid down. "We are all right," he said, sitting down at the kitchen table where she had his supper waiting. He said it as though he had been holding the words for a long time and was finally letting them out. "We have been all right," she said. "We are now better than all right." "Yes," he said. He looked across the table at her. Daniel was asleep upstairs. The house was warm and quiet and entirely theirs. "Lavinia, I want you to always know, that there is not a day that passes that I do not understand exactly what I have." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "I know that," she said softly. "You have never let me doubt it." That spring, Billy Crane announced that he had asked Dottie's young man from the land office for his sister's hand, and that she had accepted. Lavinia and Frank gave them a supper at the ranch house to celebrate, and the evening was warm and full of laughter, and the kind of easy joy that good people produce together. Dottie arrived in her best dress and sat next to Lavinia on the porch after supper and said, looking out at the Kansas dusk, "Do you remember the first night you came to Caldwell? How impossible it all seemed." "I was not quite as calm as I appeared," Lavinia admitted. Dottie laughed. "I thought you were the most composed person I had ever seen in my life. I was actually slightly intimidated." "You recovered quickly," Lavinia said. "I did. I am very resilient." Dottie looked sidelong at her. "Are you happy, Lavinia, truly?" Lavinia looked out at her land now. She allowed herself to think without reservation, going dark and golden in the last evening light, and at the silhouette of Frank on the far side of the yard, talking with Billy with his easy, quiet manner, and at the house behind her, warm and solid, built from Kansas limestone by a man who had taught his son to care for it, and now taken up into a family that she had built from nothing, from a single brave journey west and $4.32. "Truly," she said, "more than I knew to hope for." In June of 1885, Frank rode the fence line of the newly acquired North Pasture and came home with a piece of news that made Lavinia briefly set down everything she was doing and simply stand in the kitchen thinking. He had found, along the North Creek, a section of bottom land that was extraordinarily well-watered and richly soiled, and which had apparently been used for small-scale farming by the previous owner of the Dawson parcel. With the right cultivation, he said, it could produce enough hay to substantially reduce their winter feed costs. Lavinia had, in the years since coming to the Thatcher Ranch, added to her skills a working knowledge of the agricultural realities of the Kansas plains, and she knew enough to understand what he was describing. She also saw, almost immediately, an implication beyond what he had articulated. "If we can produce our own hay," she said, "at scale, we can eventually supply neighboring ranches as well. There are 4 operations within 10 miles of us that I know are buying feed from Caldwell every winter." Frank looked at her. "That is considerably more involved than keeping our own feed costs down." "Yes," she said, but the infrastructure is the same. The land is already there. It is a question of capacity and timing. He sat down slowly, the way he sat when he was genuinely thinking rather than just listening. That would require another hand, possibly two, a mowing machine, a hay press eventually. The railroad makes the economics of a hay press viable, she said. Things cost less to ship in now. He was quiet for a long while. She waited. She had learned in 3 years of being married to Frank Thatcher that his silences were working silences and were not to be filled. "Let us look at the numbers," he said at last. They spent 3 evenings looking at the numbers. On the 4th evening, Frank sat back from the table and looked at his wife across the lamplit kitchen and said, "You are almost certainly right." "I am reliably right about numbers," she said, without false modesty, because it was simply true. "I have noticed," he said. They began preparing the bottom land for hay production in the late summer of 1885, clearing the overgrown sections with the help of the full crew, and Frank engaged a second buyer he had been in contact with at the rail station in Caldwell about projected volumes for the following year. The operation was modest at first, but it was the right foundation. That same autumn, Lavinia discovered she was expecting again. She told Frank on the porch as she had the first time, and his response was essentially the same immediate concern for her, followed swiftly by the particular quietly brilliant happiness that she had come to associate with the best moments between them. "You are certain you are well," he said. "I am considerably more experienced this time," she said, "and I know exactly what to watch for. That is not precisely the same as being well." "Frank," she said firmly, "I am very well." "I would tell you if I were not." "I know you would," he said. "That is the only reason I will believe you." She smiled at him in the dark. "Good." The winter of 1885 to 1886 was one of the hardest in Kansas memory. What later became known as the Great Die-Up, the catastrophic combination of drought and blizzard that devastated cattle ranches across the plains, was already beginning to make its early signs felt in the Kansas borderlands, though the worst of it would strike further north. The Thatcher Ranch lost cattle, but their preparations, the fully stocked cellar, the new north pasture with its creek-bottom water source, the hay production they had started, meant they lost far less than their neighbors. Frank was exhausted from the sustained effort of getting through it, and Lavinia managed the house and the accounts, and the correspondence and the daily logistics of a ranch, under weather pressure with a competence that Ernesto Reyes, who had seen a great deal in his long career, described to Raphael one evening as something close to miraculous. In February of 1886, through a blizzard and then a cold, clear morning after it, Lavinia gave birth to a daughter. She was smaller than Daniel had been, with a remarkable quantity of dark hair and an expression of dignified calm that appeared even in her first hours, and which strongly suggested she had her father's temperament. "She looks just like you," Frank said, sitting on the edge of the bed holding her the way he had held Daniel 3 years before, with that same stunned absolute tenderness. "She does not," Lavinia said. "She has your nose. She has your eyes. She has my eyes and your nose, and she already looks as though she will not be argued with, which is probably from both sides." Frank looked up from the baby with an expression so completely happy that Lavinia felt it like warmth coming through a window on a cold day. "Clara," he said, "can we name her Clara, after the mare?" "I always thought it was a beautiful name," he said, slightly defensive. Lavinia laughed, and it hurt because of the birth, and she did not care. "Clara is a beautiful name," she said. "Clara Thatcher it is." Clara proved to be exactly as dignified and determined as her first hours had suggested. She and Daniel, who was 2.5 and deeply uncertain about this development initially, came to an arrangement within a few weeks that seemed to satisfy both parties, largely because Daniel decided that having someone to instruct was actually quite appealing, and Clara clearly had no intention of taking instruction from anyone. The spring of 1886, coming after that brutal winter, felt like grace. The grass came back green and deep along the creek bottoms, the cattle recovered their condition, and the hay operation on the north parcel produced its first significant commercial harvest. Frank sold the surplus to 2 neighboring ranches and one of the livery operations in Caldwell, and the income was exactly what Lavinia had projected, which she noted privately in the household accounts with something that was not quite smugness but was in that direction. Raphael turned out to have a natural talent for the hay operation and took over much of its daily management, with a quiet competence that reminded Lavinia pleasantly of his mentor Ernesto. Billy Crane, now married to Dottie's friend and moved to a small place of his own near Caldwell, still came out for the big roundups and was always welcome at the supper table when he did. There were darker moments that spring too, because the West in 1886 did not allow for unbroken ease. They heard about ranches further north that had been completely destroyed by the winter, entire operations representing decades of work and life wiped out in months. Some of those ranchers came through Caldwell heading east, going back to wherever they had come from, and Lavinia saw their faces in town on a supply run one April morning and felt the weight of it, the knowledge that the same land that had given her everything had taken everything from them. It was not a comfortable knowledge, but it was an honest one. The West was not a promised paradise. It was a bargain, and the terms were hard, and you had to be smart and lucky and willing to work like a beast, and even then it could take you. She and Frank talked about it that evening because they talked about everything. Holloway was trying to do to us in 1882 what the winter did to those people this year, she said. Take the eastern pasture, strip out the most valuable section of the land. He would have done it too, Frank said, if you had not seen it clearly. You would have figured it out, she said. Later, he said, after more damage, he looked at her directly. I do not say enough, Lavinia, what you have meant to this place, what you have saved us from and what you have built here. You have said it plenty, she said. I will say it again, he said simply. You came here to find work. You found it. You also found it worth staying for, and I know that was not guaranteed. I am grateful every single day that you chose to stay. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the kitchen that had been chaos on her first morning, and was now the warm, precise center of a life she had built deliberately and with her full attention. Daniel's wooden horse was in the corner. Clara's small blanket was over the chair back. The accounts were in their leather folder on the shelf, precise and current. I did not stay because I chose to stay, she said. I stayed because this became home. There is a difference. He reached across and took her hand, as he had on that first November porch, as he always did when words were not quite enough. By the summer of 1887, the Thatcher Ranch was one of the most solidly established operations in its part of Sumner County. Not the largest, not the flashiest, but the kind of place that people in the county looked at when they needed an example of what careful, intelligent, committed work could produce. Frank was respected in the way that quiet, capable people are respected genuinely, without the noise that surrounded lesser men. Lavinia had become, somewhat to her own amusement, a person that neighboring women came to for advice on household accounts and practical management, because her reputation for clear-headed competence had spread without her having done anything particular to spread it. She was also, that summer, expecting for the third time. They did not make a great ceremony of the announcement within the household by this point, because Lavinia was 30 and Frank was 35, and they were experienced parents who had been through enough to maintain equanimity. She told him over coffee on a Sunday morning, and he reached across the table and covered her hand with both of his, and they looked at each other across the breakfast table in the Kansas morning light with the particular private joy of people who are completely at home in their life together. "Are you well?" he asked, as he always asked. "I am very well," she said, as she always answered. The third child, born in February of 1888, was another son. They named him Thomas, for the quiet, capable man who had kept every piece of machinery on the ranch running through every hard season, and who had never asked for particular acknowledgement and received it here, in the naming of a child, which was the best acknowledgement Lavinia knew how to give. Thomas was a peaceful baby, which was a blessing after two children who had entered the world with opinions. He grew into a tranquil, observant child who watched everything with his father's gray-green eyes, and who smiled rarely but completely when he did. And Frank called him the old man of the family, which made Lavinia laugh every time. The years moved as years do, not quickly, not slowly, but in the particular rhythm of a full and working life. Daniel grew from an imperious toddler into a curious, energetic boy who spent every available hour on horseback and drove Ernesto Reyes to what the old vaquero described, with great dignity, as the edge of his considerable patience. Clara grew into a grave, thoughtful child who read every book she could get her hands on, and who asked questions of such precision that Frank often told Lavinia privately she was going to be a lawyer or a judge or some other form of professional trouble. The town of Caldwell itself was changing in those years, as the cattle trade shifted and the town began its transition from a rough trail drive stop to something more settled and domestic. Churches were established, a school was built, and the particular wildness of the early cattle trade years gave way to a more complicated kind of life. The territory to the south, the Indian Territory that formed the other side of the Kansas border, was under enormous pressure as land rushes began in 1889, and the push for settlement intensified. Lavinia watched these changes with the attentiveness she brought to everything, aware that the world around their land was shifting in ways that would eventually affect even the most stable of operations. She and Frank talked about it, as they talked about everything. The unassigned lands opening in April of 1889, the land run that sent thousands of settlers streaming south across the Kansas border. They watched it from a distance, aware of what it meant and not unmoved by the complexity of it. Land that had been promised to Indian tribes was being opened to white settlement at the stroke of a government pen, and whatever the newspapers said about progress and civilization, Lavinia had spent enough time in Kansas to know the human cost of those transactions. She had seen the Osage people whose ancestral territory covered land now farmed and ranched by people exactly like her. She did not look away from that. "The land we have built our life on was once someone else's," she said to Frank one evening. "All of it. That is true, and it should stay true in our minds, even though we cannot undo it." "I know it," Frank said. "My father knew it too. He said once that a man who builds his future on another man's loss better make something worth having, because there is no other way to honor what was sacrificed." He was quiet. "I do not know if we have done enough. I suspect we have not, but we have tried to do right within our reach." "Yes," she said, "that is all any of us can manage, and we have to keep trying." In 1890, Daniel Thatcher turned 7 and started school in Caldwell, riding in on the little gray pony Frank had given him for Christmas the previous year, with an expression of combined excitement and determination that Lavinia recognized as entirely her own face rearranged onto someone else's. Clara was 4 and full of questions about everything. Thomas was 2 and peaceful. The school in Caldwell was a decent institution by the standards of the time, with a young teacher named Miss Pratt who had come west from Ohio, the coincidence of which made Lavinia feel a warmth toward her before they had exchanged a single word. She visited the school in October of 1890 to see where Daniel spent his days, and she and Miss Pratt had a conversation over the small teacher's desk that lasted almost an hour, about Ohio and Kansas and books, and what was available for education in the county. And she came home with a list of volumes she intended to donate to the school from the growing collection she had assembled in the ranch house sitting room. Frank looked at the list that evening. "You are going to give away half our library," he said. "We have 2 libraries," she said, "the sitting room and the bedroom shelf. We can spare the sitting room." "We can get more books," he said agreeably. "We can," she said. "We will." "That is rather the point." He smiled at her with the quiet, warm smile. 8 years into their marriage, and it still produced the same effect on her as it always had, which she considered something approaching a miracle, and also, more practically, a reliable indicator that she had made the correct decision on the bank of Bluff Creek in November of 1882. The winter of 1891 brought a new challenge in the form of a fence dispute with a neighbor to the north, a man named Aldridge who had bought the property 3 years prior, and who had slowly been running his fence line a few feet at a time toward the Thatcher boundary. It was the kind of dispute that escalated badly in the West if allowed to, and Frank had the full legal documentation ready. Lavinia had made certain of that, and settled the matter through a formal survey and a meeting with the county recorder that cost Aldridge the ground he had accumulated and earned him a permanent reputation in the county as a man whose word about boundary lines should not be trusted. Frank handled it without heat. He always handled things without heat. That quality, Lavinia had come to understand, was not coldness. It was the product of a man who was sufficiently confident in his own position that he did not need to perform his certainty loudly. She told him so one evening after the Aldridge matter was resolved. "You are not a man who needs to be louder than the facts," she said. He thought about this. "My father told me that the loudest man in any disagreement is usually the most frightened one," he said. "I have generally found that to be true." "Your father was a wise man," she said. "He would have liked you enormously," Frank said. "He would have respected you. That was the higher thing with him." She felt that one in a specific place. "I wish I could have known him," she said. "He would have said the same thing about you," Frank said. "I am fairly certain of it." By 1892, the hay operation had been running for 6 years and had become a stable secondary income for the ranch, with a small but reliable customer base among neighboring operations. The cattle herd had grown to its largest size, and the combination of the North pasture and the original Thatcher land and the Henderson parcel meant they had sufficient range to run it comfortably. The railroad was a presence in their lives that Lavinia had come to take for granted, though she occasionally reminded herself that it was not 10 years old in this part of Kansas, and that its arrival had genuinely transformed what was possible. She was 34 years old, and she sat one morning in the June light at the kitchen table with the accounts book open in front of her and a cup of coffee, and the sound of Clara and Thomas playing in the yard outside and Daniel's pony moving in the near pasture, and she let herself look at the numbers in front of her not as a task to be accomplished, but as a record of a life. Every entry was a day of work and a day of living, and the columns were balanced, and the ranch was sound, and the family that she had not known she was building when she stepped off a stagecoach with $4.32 was real and whole and entirely here. Frank came in from the morning's work and poured himself coffee and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out at Clara and Thomas in the yard. "Thomas has taught Clara to whistle," he said. Lavinia looked up. "Has he?" "She is better at it than he is already," Frank said. She looked very smug about it. "That is exactly right," Lavinia said. He turned from the window and looked at her at the table, and his expression was the one she knew best and loved best. The steady open one that was not quite a smile, but contained everything a smile contained and more. He crossed the kitchen and bent and kissed her on the top of her head the way he did sometimes in the mornings, a gesture so habitual and so entirely without performance that it was, to her, more romantic than anything elaborate could have been. "How are the numbers?" he asked. "The numbers are excellent," she said. "We are better than all right." "We have been for a while," he said. "Yes," she said. "We have been for a while." He poured more coffee and sat down across from her, and through the window they could hear Clara whistling with surprising competence, while Thomas made encouraging sounds, and the Kansas morning moved around them like something alive and entirely their own. That evening, with all 3 children in bed and the house quiet, they sat on the porch in the warm June dark the way they had sat on porches for 10 years, and Lavinia leaned into Frank's side, and he put his arm around her, and the stars over Kansas were as brilliant and thick as they had been on any night she could remember, pressing down toward the earth in their thousands, and the land moved around them in the summer wind with its familiar voice. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. She was quiet for a moment, choosing the words not because she lacked them, but because she wanted to get them exactly right. "When I came here," she said, "I was 24 years old and I had nothing except what I could do. I was not unhappy exactly, but I was alone in a way that had nothing to do with people being present or absent. I was alone in the way of someone who has no one whose life is built alongside their own." He was listening. He was always listening with everything he had. "I came here looking for work," she said. "That is a fact. I stood in Mrs. Cobble's hotel and I asked for work and I got it, and I was grateful for it. And then I walked up the front path of this house and knocked on the door and told a stranger I could run his household, which I could and did. And I want you to know that somewhere in the middle of all of that practical management, somewhere between the accounts and the preserving and the fence dispute, and the winter when we lost the cattle and the birth of our children, somewhere in all of that completely real and ordinary life, I found something I did not know I had been looking for. I found the person whose life is built alongside mine." Frank tightened his arm around her and pressed his lips to her temple, and he held them there for a long moment. "I did not know I was waiting for you," he said, quietly, into her hair. "I thought I was simply running a ranch. I thought the life I had was the life I was going to have. And then you knocked on my door." "I knocked very purposefully," she said. He laughed softly against her. "You knocked as though you already lived here," he said. "I suppose I felt that I might," she said. "I will not pretend otherwise." "I fell in love with you somewhere around the corrected ledger," he said. "That was 9 days after I arrived," she said. "I know," he said. "I am aware it was very quick. I told myself it was professional respect." "So did I," she said. He pulled back enough to look at her face in the darkness, and she could see the lines that the years had put there, and the steadiness that the years had only deepened, and she thought that she had been right all along that first morning at the fence line in November. This was the right thing, this was the thing worth building. "Are you happy?" he asked. The same question Dottie had asked her on the porch 7 years before. "More than I knew to hope for," she said. The same answer. Because it was still true, and had kept being true through everything, and she expected it to keep being true through everything still to come. The cricket song rose around the porch, and the wind moved through the dark grass, and the stars kept their ancient patient watch over the Kansas plains. And Lavinia Thatcher, who had come west at 24 with nothing but herself and a fierce belief in what she could make of a chance given, sat with her husband's arm around her and looked out at the land they had built together and felt, all the way down to the bedrock of her, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The years that followed moved in the deep, comfortable rhythm of a well-built life. Daniel grew into a young man who was clearly going to be a rancher. He had his grandfather's eye for cattle and his mother's head for practical management, a combination that Frank said privately made him very glad the ranch would have a future. Clara, as predicted, turned out to be a person of formidable intellectual precision, who was going to do whatever she wanted and would do it exceptionally well, and the school in Caldwell could not contain her much longer. Thomas remained the quiet, philosophical one, watching everything carefully and speaking when it mattered, which Lavinia privately thought was the best possible disposition for someone who was going to have to live in the world with the other two. There were ordinary hardships and ordinary joys in those years, the ordinary and extraordinary alternation of any real life. A late frost one April that took the plum trees. A summer when the hay came in so thick and green it seemed like a gift. The year Raphael married a woman named Soledad who came from Santa Fe, and who was a better cook than Lavinia. A fact that Lavinia acknowledged honestly and without resentment, because she was a fair-minded person, and Soledad's tamales were objectively magnificent. Ernesto Reyes retired in 1894, and moved to live with his daughter in San Antonio, and they held a supper for him at the ranch house that left several grown men, including Frank, with suspiciously bright eyes. Ernesto had been on this land longer than Lavinia had been, longer even than Frank in any meaningful sense, and his departure was the departure of an era. But he left well and in dignity, and he knew he was leaving something that would endure. On the morning Ernesto left, he stood at the gate with his hat in his hand and looked at Lavinia for a long moment. "Senora Thatcher," he said, "when you first came here, I thought you would not last the winter." "And now?" she asked. "Now I think this land will outlast the rest of us precisely because you are on it," he said. He bowed to her in his formal, gracious way, and she felt the sting of genuine emotion behind her eyes that she refused to let become tears until he had gone around the bend in the road. Then she went inside and let them come, standing in the kitchen she had organized 12 years before, and Frank came in behind her and put his hands on her shoulders without a word, and she leaned back into him for a moment. "He will be fine," Frank said. "I know," she said. "It is just the end of something." "And the continuation of something," he said. She straightened and wiped her eyes with the practical efficiency she brought to everything. "Yes," she said, "and the continuation of something." She took a breath. "I am going to start supper." He bent and kissed her cheek. "I will bring in the wood." They moved through the kitchen in the comfortable choreography of people who have shared a space for many years and know exactly where the other one is without looking, and the ordinary evening gathered itself around them. And it was not a grand thing or a dramatic thing, but it was the best kind of real. The summer of 1895 found the Thatcher Ranch in the fullness of what it had always been trying to become. The house had been extended by a room in 1891, a proper sitting room where Lavinia kept her rebuilt library, and where Clara did most of her reading, and where the family gathered on winter evenings around the good stove Frank had brought up from Caldwell at considerable expense. The kitchen garden was a serious productive operation that supplied most of their vegetable needs and a good portion of their fruit. The land was in the best condition it had ever been. Daniel was 12 and already doing real work on the ranch. Clara was 9 and reading law books she had found somehow, through means that Lavinia preferred not to inquire into too closely. Thomas was 7 and had demonstrated a surprising gift for anything mechanical, including the hay press, which he had begun to take apart and reassemble on his own initiative in a way that was either very impressive or very alarming, depending on the day. Frank and Lavinia were, at 37 and 43, precisely what they had always been moving toward being, a partnership so thoroughly built and so thoroughly proven that it had become simply the structure of their days. They disagreed sometimes, as people living closely together necessarily do. She thought he was too conservative about expanding the hay operation. He thought she pushed too hard and needed more rest than she took. These disagreements were conducted with the same directness they had always brought to each other, and they were always resolved, and they always left the parties slightly better informed about each other than before. One evening that summer, when all 3 children were asleep and the house was quiet and the summer dark outside was warm and cricket loud, Frank poured them each a small glass of the good whiskey he kept for particular occasions. "What is this for?" Lavinia asked, accepting hers with some curiosity. "It is 12 years," he said. She thought for a moment. "Since I came to work here. Since you knocked on my door and told me you were the best person for the job," he said. "I was right," she said. "You were absolutely right," he said. He raised his glass. "To 12 years and to what comes next." She raised hers. "To what comes next," she said. "Which will be, as all of it has been, probably more complicated and more wonderful than either of us anticipates." He smiled at her. "Almost certainly." They drank, and the summer night moved around the house, and the Kansas sky beyond the windows was full of that deep, impossible blue going to black, and the stars that had watched over 10,000 years of human life on these plains watched over them too, and it was entirely enough, and it was entirely everything, and it was entirely home. Lavinia Keene had come west looking for work, and the cowboy had offered her a home and his heart instead. She had taken both, and built with them something so real and so lasting and so thoroughly alive that on quiet evenings she sometimes sat with her hands in her lap and simply felt the weight and the warmth of it. This life she had walked into on a July morning in 1882 with nothing but herself and her willingness to try. She had no regrets, not a single one. She had found exactly what she came for, and considerably more than she had known to ask. And the land rolled on around them in the Kansas wind, green and gold and endlessly open, and the house stood solid on the limestone foundation that a good man had built for his son, who had kept it faithfully for the woman who had walked up the front path one summer morning and knocked on the door and changed everything. Forever and entirely, and as completely as the West itself had changed her, which was to say, all the way down to the bone. All the way down to the truth of what a person most deeply is when they are finally home.